When a group of armed thugs storms a biker's funeral in Tucson, Arizona, they see only a quiet woman in a black vest standing behind the pulpit, and they make the worst mistake of their lives. Reverend Marisol Reyes has served as chaplain to the Hells Angels Desert Iron chapter for over 2 decades, presiding over more funerals, more confessions, and more hard truths than any of these men have years on earth. But the secret she's carrying into this funeral is heavier than her title. She knows who really caused the death of the man they've come to bury, and she's kept that knowledge locked in silence for 20 years. The man leading the disruption is Declan Cole, the dead man's estranged son, who has come not to grieve, but to collect. What neither of them knows yet is that before this funeral ends, every buried truth is coming out of the ground, whether anyone is ready or not. The wrong funeral to crash. The church smelled like motor oil and marigolds. That was the first thing Declan noticed when he pushed through the side door. Not the rows of leather-clad mourners, not the hand-painted banner above the altar that read, "Ride Free." Hector. Not even the cluster of chrome and steel parked 3 deep in the lot outside, like a standing army of machines. Just that smell. Motor oil and marigolds. Like someone had tried to make a garage into a cathedral and split the difference. He told himself it didn't hit him anywhere. He was good at that. There were maybe 60 people inside the small adobe church on the eastern edge of Tucson, and every single one of them wore a patch on their back. Desert Iron Chapter. The patches were different colors and shapes depending on rank and road miles, but the skull and wings logo was consistent across every set of shoulders like a uniform. Declan had done his research. He knew what he was walking into. He had 3 men behind him, Rourke, Santos, and a 3rd man, everyone just called Pike. And he had a folded legal document in his inside jacket pocket, and the reasonable conviction that the law was on his side. What he had not adequately researched was the specific weight of 60 sets of eyes turning toward the door at once. He kept walking anyway. Rourke fell into step on his left, Santos on his right. Pike stationed himself near the entrance. The murmur that had been running through the congregation dropped away completely as Declan moved up the center aisle, and the silence that replaced it was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of people deciding something. At the front of the church, behind a simple pine pulpit, stood a woman. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, with dark hair shot through with silver, pulled back from her face in a practical knot. She wore a plain black vest over a white collarless shirt, and she had the kind of stillness about her that Declan associated with people who had learned through long and specific experience that most situations did not require movement to be handled. She was holding an open book, but she wasn't reading from it. She was watching him walk up the aisle with an expression that wasn't quite calm and wasn't quite anything else he had a word for. On the altar behind her, in a simple wooden casket with a single wreath of yellow marigolds laid across the lid, was whatever remained of Hector Vega. Declan didn't look at the casket. He stopped about 6 feet from the front pew and raised his voice to carry to the back of the room. "I apologize for the interruption." He did not sound apologetic. "My name is Declan Cole. Hector Vega was my father. I have a legal claim to this estate that I need to discuss before any further proceedings take place, and I'm asking everyone here to step outside for approximately 20 minutes while I speak with whoever is managing the arrangements." The silence held for a long beat. Then the woman behind the pulpit closed her book, and she said in a voice that was neither loud nor soft, but somehow filled the room the same way organ music does, "The arrangements are mine to manage, and the proceedings are going to continue exactly as planned." Declan turned his full attention to her. And you are? Reverend Marisol Reyes, chaplain of this chapter. She set the book down on the pulpit with a quiet, final sound. You're Hector's son. He talked about you. Something moved through Declan's chest that he immediately pushed back down. Then you know I have standing here. My lawyers have documented. Your lawyers, Marisol said, are not in this room. You are. And what you are right now in this room is a man who has interrupted his father's funeral. She let that sit for exactly one breath before she continued. I'd like to ask you to sit down, wait until the service is finished, and then come speak with me privately. That's the respectful thing to do. Declan reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded document. I don't have time for the respectful thing. There are assets in question that I have legal right to, and I have reason to believe documentation is being withheld by me, Marisol said. Her voice didn't change. Her face didn't change. But something shifted in the room, the way air shifts before a storm, the kind of pressure change you feel in your ears before you hear the thunder. Rourke moved up beside Declan and put his hand inside his jacket. It was a practiced gesture, visible and deliberate, the kind of thing done not necessarily to draw a weapon, but to make clear that a weapon was present. Declan had told him to hold off on that until he gave the signal. Apparently, Rourke had decided the signal was implied. The reaction from the congregation was not what Rourke had likely anticipated. Nobody screamed. Nobody scrambled. Nobody's hands went up. Instead, the men in the front 3 rows, 6 of them, then 10 of them, then all of them, as the motion spread backward through the pews like a slow wave, stood up. Not rushed, not aggressive, just stood, turned toward Declan and his men, and waited. It took Declan approximately 3 seconds to understand that he had catastrophically miscalculated the nature of this room. Rourke's hand came back out of his jacket empty, faster than it had gone in. Declan did not step back. He had enough sense and enough pride not to step back. But he recalibrated fast, because the alternative was to be very stupid in front of a very large number of people who had clearly been to funerals before and were not afraid of what came after them. From the 4th pew on the left, one man had not stood. He was older than most of the others, heavy-set, with a gray beard trimmed close to his jaw, and chapter patches running up both arms of his vest. He was watching Marisol, not Declan, and his expression was not the flat, waiting expression of the men standing around him. His expression was something closer to a plea. Marisol did not look at him. Her eyes were on Declan. She came around from behind the pulpit and walked down the 2 low steps to the floor of the church. She moved without hurry, with the particular economy of motion that belongs to people who have learned that urgency and haste are not the same thing. She stopped in front of Declan at a distance that was closer than he expected, close enough that he would have had to be the one to step back if he wanted more space between them. She said, quietly, now meant for him and not for the room, "You want to talk about disrespect, son. You just walked into a church full of men who've buried their brothers, and you pointed a gun at the woman who said the prayers over every single grave. I'd think real carefully about what happens next." Declan looked at her. He was a tall man, and she was not a tall woman, and the geometry of the situation should have given him some kind of advantage. It didn't. There was something in her eyes, not anger, not contempt, something older and more complicated than either of those things, that made him feel, for the first time since he'd walked through the door, that he was the one who didn't understand the room he was standing in. He said, keeping his voice even, "I just need access to whatever documents were left in the estate's care. That's all. This doesn't have to be a confrontation." It was a confrontation the moment you walked in, Marisol said. You made it one, not me. She glanced briefly at Rourke, then back to Declan. Tell your man to keep his hands where everyone can see them. Then sit down in the back row, wait for the service to finish, and meet me outside after. She turned, as if the matter were decided, began moving back toward the altar. Over her shoulder she added, without turning around, Your father would want you here for this, whatever you think of him. The words landed somewhere Declan had not prepared to have anything land. He stood in the center aisle, while the standing man in the pews watched him in a silence that had gradually become something other than hostile, still watchful, but edged now with something that might in another context have been called patient. And he understood, in a way that his legal preparation had not equipped him for, that the architecture of power in this room was not organized the way he'd assumed. He did not sit in the back row. His pride wouldn't bend quite that far. He moved to the side aisle instead, found a spot near the wall where he could stand without being in anyone's direct line of sight, and he crossed his arms and kept his face flat and watched. Marisol returned to the pulpit. The congregation settled. The service resumed. She spoke about Hector Vega for the next 40 minutes, and Declan, who had come here prepared to feel nothing, found that the 40 minutes were harder to get through than he'd expected. She spoke about a man who had ridden with this chapter for 31 years, who had, in the words of 3 different members she quoted directly, been the person you called at 2 in the morning when everything went wrong. Not because he always had the answer, but because he showed up. She spoke about his habit of bringing food to the families of members who were in the hospital, always without announcement, always the same. Tamales from a place on South 6th that had been there since before most of the chapter members were born. She spoke about the way he'd fixed engines at no charge for people in the neighborhood who couldn't afford a mechanic, and the way he'd argued with himself out loud when he was trying to make a decision, carrying on both sides of the conversation simultaneously, until whatever he was wrestling with had been talked through enough to settle. She did not speak about his son. Declan noticed that specifically. She spoke about Hector Vega as a man fully realized his humor, his stubbornness, his specific and consistent kindness, his habit of quoting song lyrics at inappropriate moments as if they were scripture. And she did not mention, not once, the wife he'd left behind, or the 8-year-old boy who had watched him drive away. Whether that was kindness or deliberate omission, Declan couldn't tell. What he could tell, and this came to him slowly over the course of the service, the way water finds its level, was that the woman behind the pulpit had known his father. Not known him in the way a chaplain knows a congregation member. Known him the way you know someone when you've sat with them through the worst things and the best things, and the ordinary Wednesday afternoons that are neither. There was a texture to her voice when she spoke about Hector Vega that was different from the texture it had when she'd addressed Declan in the aisle, and he was a man who had negotiated enough deals, read enough rooms to know the difference between performed authority and the kind that runs bone deep. He stood against the wall and kept his arms crossed and told himself that none of this changed anything. Through the service, his eyes kept returning to the man in the 4th pew, the heavy-set man with the gray beard who had stayed seated when everyone else stood. The man watched Marisol the way you watch something you're afraid of, which was interesting because he didn't look like a man who was afraid of much. He was large and weathered and wore his patches with the ease of someone who'd earned every one of them. But his eyes, fixed on the back of Marisol's head for the duration of the service, had a quality to them that Declan, without knowing why, filed away. At the close of the service, Marisol reached into the left pocket of her vest and drew something out, a plain brown envelope, letter-sized, sealed. She set it on the pulpit ledge and placed both hands flat on either side of it, and she said to the congregation, "Hector left this in my keeping. We'll open it together at the graveside, as he asked, not before." She picked the envelope back up and returned it to her pocket. "For now, let's take him home." The man in the fourth pew closed his eyes. Declan watched the envelope disappear into Marisol's pocket. And for the first time since he'd arrived in Tucson, his legal documentation felt slightly less certain in his own hands. Outside, in the late October heat that Tucson held on to long past the calendar's insistence that it should have released it, the chapter began the process of loading out. Engines started in a sequence that built into a rolling thunder, echoing off the adobe walls and the low surrounding hills. And Declan stood in the parking lot beside his rented sedan, while 60 motorcycles formed up in a procession that moved with the slow, deliberate gravity of a military escort. Rourke came up beside him. "You want to follow?" "Yes," Declan said. He watched the procession roll out, and he kept watching until the last bike had cleared the lot, and in the quiet left behind, he found himself thinking about tamales and a restaurant on South 6th Street, and a man he hadn't seen since he was 8 years old, carrying both sides of a conversation with himself until whatever was wrong had been talked through enough to settle. He got in the car. He told Rourke to drive, and he looked out the window at the Arizona scrubland scrolling past the saguaro, standing in their particular dignified isolation, arms raised like they were bearing witness to something. And he reached into his jacket and held the folded legal document without opening it. He had a lawyer in Phoenix who had located Hector Vega 6 months ago, after 2 years of searching. The search had begun not from any desire for reunion, but from the practical reality that Hector, who had apparently never done a conventional thing in his life, had died without any legally recorded next of kin designation, which meant that the estate, including a piece of commercial property in Midtown Tucson that the Phoenix lawyer had assessed at considerably more than nothing, was sitting in probate limbo. Declan was the biological son. The documentation proved it. The law was straightforward. What the lawyer had not told him, because the lawyer didn't know, was that Hector Vega had apparently spent 31 years being somebody. That information was making Declan's straightforward legal situation feel somewhat more complicated. He thought about the woman, the Reverend, the Chaplain, whatever she was, standing in front of 60 men and telling him to sit down, and the 60 men sitting down, not because she told them to, but because they had already decided she was right. He thought about the envelope in her vest pocket. He thought about the man in the fourth pew who had stayed seated and whose eyes had carried something Declan was still trying to name. The procession turned ahead of them onto a 2-lane road that ran toward the eastern edge of Tucson, where the cemetery sat against the base of the Rincon Mountains. And Declan folded his legal document back up and put it in his pocket and watched the line of bikes roll through the afternoon light. He was here for a property claim. He reminded himself of that specifically. He was not here to feel anything about a man he hadn't known since he was 8 years old. The graveside service was brief, a reading, a prayer, the lowering the flowers. Marisol stood at the head of the grave and spoke the final words without notes, without the book, without anything in her hands except the envelope she held loosely at her side. She did not open it at the graveside. Declan watched her and wondered whether that was a deliberate choice or whether something had changed the plan. After the final amen, the chapter members began the gradual, unhurried dispersal that follows every graveside service, where nobody really wants to be the first to leave. Men spoke to each other in low voices. A few knelt at the grave for a private moment. Children there were, 3 or 4 children Declan hadn't noticed inside the church, kept quietly at the back, were gathered up by a pair of women who were apparently not chapter members, wearing the restrained colors of civilian life. Declan moved through the outer edge of this gathering toward Marisol. She was talking to an older woman with white hair and a formal black dress. Not a chapter member. Someone from outside. And she finished that conversation with a touch on the woman's arm and turned to face Declan before he reached her, as if she'd known he was coming. "Walk with me," she said. She didn't wait to see if he would. She moved away from the grave toward the far edge of the cemetery where the older headstones stood, the ones from the first decades of the last century, and Declan followed, because he was beginning to understand a particular kind of authority that you either moved in relation to or you moved against, and he hadn't yet decided which this was. She walked until they were far enough from the rest of the mourners that conversation wouldn't carry. Then she stopped and faced him and said, "I'm going to tell you some things. You don't have to believe them right now, but I'm going to ask you to listen without interrupting, and then you can say whatever you need to say." Declan put his hands in his pockets. "Go ahead." "Your father did not have a will as your lawyers understand the term," she said. "He had no monetary assets to speak of. The property your lawyer found is held in a chapter trust, not in Hector's personal name. You won't be able to claim it because it was never his to leave. I'm sorry if that's not what you came here to hear." Declan absorbed that. His Phoenix lawyer was going to have a very uncomfortable phone call in his near future. "Then what's in the envelope?" Marisol's eyes held steady on his. They were dark eyes, the kind that had seen enough that they no longer needed to communicate alarm. "Something Hector left for me to manage when the time came," she said. "It's not a financial document, and it's not something I'm in a position to discuss with you before I've opened it in the context he specified, which was in front of the chapter." Declan felt a flare of frustration move through him that he kept out of his voice with effort. "So you're telling me I've flown to Tucson and walked into a funeral and made a complete disaster of myself in front of 60 people, and there's nothing here for me?" Marisol looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something, shifting almost imperceptibly in the texture of her voice. "I didn't say that." He met her eyes. "Then what are you saying?" "I'm saying," she said carefully, "that the thing your father left behind is not nothing. It's just not what you came looking for." She paused. "Will you stay for tonight? There's a gathering at the chapter house. The envelope gets opened there. You should be present for it." Declan studied her face for some indication of what this was. An invitation? A trap? A test? He couldn't read it clearly, and that itself was unusual enough to be notable. He was generally good at reading faces. "Why?" he said. "Why do you want me there?" Marisol's expression did something quiet and specific that he would spend the rest of the evening trying to identify. Then she said, "Because your father wanted you there. He just didn't know how to ask." She turned and walked back toward the grave, where the last of the chapter members were making their goodbyes, and Declan stood among the old headstones in the October afternoon and felt the Arizona sun on the back of his neck, and did not, for the first time since he'd arrived in Tucson, feel entirely certain of what he was doing here. From across the cemetery, the man with the gray beard, the one from the fourth pew, was watching him. When their eyes met, the man looked away first. And that, Declan thought, was interesting. What the dead man left behind. The chapter house was on the south side of Tucson, a converted warehouse on a dead-end industrial street that backed up against a rail yard, and it looked like exactly what it was, a place that had been made livable by people who valued function over appearance. and had learned over years of collective habitation that the appearance of a place and the meaning of a place were not the same category of thing. Declan arrived at 7 in the evening after spending 2 hours in his hotel room attempting to reach his Phoenix lawyer, who did not answer, and another hour sitting on the edge of the hotel bed with the legal document unfolded on the bedspread in front of him, trying to find the flaw in what Marisol had told him about the property being held in trust. He found it eventually. The flaw was that she was right. He came alone. He'd told Rourke and Santos to stand down for the night. Pike had already driven back to Phoenix, which Declan now thought had been the correct instinct. The three of them together in that church had been sufficient to make a point. What that point was, he was still revising. The chapter house had motorcycles out front, and lights spilling through high industrial windows, and the sound of voices that had the particular cadence of people who have been together long enough that they don't need to be careful with each other. A prospect, young, maybe 20, wearing a cut without full patches, met him at the door and looked at him for a long moment before stepping aside. Inside, the space was larger than it appeared from the street. Long tables had been arranged in a U-shape, with folding chairs around the outside, and the tables were covered with food brought by the women Declan had seen at the cemetery. Casseroles, platters of tamales, bottles of soda and beer in ice-filled coolers, along one wall. The patch members were seated and eating and talking in the loose, comfortable way of people carrying shared grief, in the particular manner of people who carry it, often not suppressed, not performed, but acknowledged, and set beside the food and the conversation as something that belonged there, alongside everything else. Marisol was seated at the far end of the center table. She had removed her vest and was in the white collarless shirt, and someone had brought her a plate that she was eating from with the unhurried attention of a person who understands that the body requires fuel regardless of the circumstances of the day. The brown envelope was not visible. When Declan entered the room, did not go quiet the way the church had. There was a ripple of awareness, heads turning, conversations briefly interrupted, but then something passed through the gathering. Some signal or collective decision Declan couldn't identify the source of, and the conversations resumed, and people made room for him at the nearest table. And someone put a plate in front of him without asking if he wanted one. He sat. He ate. He said very little, and people around him did not press him to say more, which was either courtesy or calculation, and he couldn't tell which. Marisol came to him about 40 minutes in, carrying her coffee, and she sat in the empty chair across from him and said, "How are you doing?" "I'm fine," Declan said, which was his default response to that question, and therefore essentially meaningless. Marisol received it as such. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and said, "Your father talked about you maybe 4 or 5 times in the 31 years I knew him." "Not often, but when he did, he was specific. He knew your birthday. He knew what grade you were in the last year he had an address for you. He knew what position you played in Little League the summer before he left." Declan kept his voice level. "He left when I was 8. I wasn't in Little League anymore after that." "No," Marisol said. "I don't imagine you were." She looked at him with the careful attention of someone who understands that the thing a person says and the thing underneath it are usually 2 different weights. He talked about you like you were a fact he had to carry, not a regret. He could manage a fact. Like your existence was something true about the world that he couldn't revise. "That's a very charitable way," Declan said, "to describe a man who drove away." "It's not charitable," Marisol said. "It's specific." She took a drink of her coffee. "There's a difference." Across the room, the man with the gray beard, Declan had learned his name was Garrett Cole, a chapter officer of some seniority, was eating alone at the far end of the opposite table, and looking at no one in particular, or appearing to look at no one in particular, which was not quite the same thing. "Who is he?" Declan asked with a small gesture of his chin. Marisol didn't turn to look. She knew exactly who he meant. "Garrett's been with the chapter for about 25 years. Road captain. He and your father had history." "Good history or bad?" She chose her next words with a precision that, in Declan's experience, usually indicated that many other words were being set aside. "Complicated history," she said. "The kind that chapters accumulate when people have to make decisions together over a long period of time." Declan watched Garrett Cole push food around his plate. "He watched you the entire service." "Yes," Marisol said. "I know. You know what he's watching for." She turned the coffee cup in her hands a slow rotation, and she said, "He's watching for what I'm going to do next." She set the cup down. "Now, can I ask you something?" Declan opened one hand. "Go ahead." "What did your mother tell you about why Hector left?" The question landed without announcement, and with enough weight that Declan felt it. He kept his face neutral. "She told me he chose to go, that he didn't want the life, the family, the responsibility, that he'd always been more interested in the road than in anything that required him to stay put." "And you believed her?" "She was my mother. She was the one who was there." "Yes," Marisol said, and something in her voice carried a weight that he noticed without being able to define. "She was." That non-answer opened something in the conversation that Declan wasn't certain he wanted opened. He said carefully, "What does that mean?" Marisol looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "It means there was more to the story. There usually is." She stood, picking up her coffee. "We'll open the envelope in about an hour, when everyone's eaten. I'd like you to stay for that." She moved away before he could press her, returning to the center of the room with the ease of someone who knows exactly where they're most needed. And Declan sat with his half-eaten plate and the sentence she'd left hanging. She was the one who was there, and tried to understand what it was loading. At 9 o'clock, Marisol called the gathering to order. It wasn't a dramatic process. She simply stood at the head of the room and said with a quiet directness that accomplished more than any raised voice would have, "Let's come together for a minute." And the room organized itself around her, chairs turning conversations, wrapping up the natural settling of a group that knows the shape of this kind of moment. She placed the envelope on the table in front of her. She said, "Hector gave me this 2 years ago. He said to open it at his funeral before his chapter, and to read whatever was in it out loud." She paused. "He didn't tell me what was in it. I've honored that." She looked around the room at the patch members, at the older women who were not members, but were present anyway, at Declan sitting at the far end, and she said, "Whatever it is, it belongs to all of us, so let's hear it." She opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, and a smaller sealed envelope within it, cream color, the kind used for personal letters, with Declan's name written on it, in a handwriting that was large and deliberate. The handwriting of someone for whom writing did not come naturally, but who had put effort into making it legible, regardless. Marisol stood very still for a moment. She looked at the smaller envelope, and something crossed her face. Quick, controlled, but visible to anyone who was watching carefully. Then she looked up and found Declan across the room. She held up the smaller envelope so he could see his name on it. "This is for you," she said. "Hector left it separately. You can read it in private." Declan stood and walked to the head of the table and took the envelope from her hands. Their fingers didn't quite touch. Marisol turned back to the larger page, the one meant for the chapter. And then Garrett Cole's voice came from the far end of the room, measured and loud enough to carry. "Before you read that, Marisol, I want to say something." The room shifted. Not the standing-up shift from the church. Something more internal. A reevaluation of the air. Marisol looked at him. Her expression was, Declan thought, like granite that had decided not to comment on the weather. "The floor is yours, Garrett," she said. Garrett rose from his chair. He was tall when he stood, and his size, in combination with his seniority in the room, gave him a gravitational pull that Declan registered the way you register approaching weather. "I just want us all to be thoughtful," Garrett said, "about what we're doing here. Hector was a brother. What he left behind in writing is going to be his last word in this chapter, and I think before we open that up to the whole room, we should consider whether he would have wanted." "He wanted it opened in front of the chapter," Marisol said. "He told me that specifically, in front of everyone who was at the service." Garrett held her eyes. There was a whole conversation happening in that held gaze, fast compressed, the kind that carries years of accumulated context in a few seconds, and Declan watched it happen without being able to hear any of it. Then Garrett sat back down, and Marisol read. The page from Hector Vega to his chapter was not long. It was written the same way he had apparently lived, plainly without ornament, with the particular directness of a man who had learned that the truth was hard enough without dressing it up. He spoke about the chapter with a specificity of affection that made several people in the room look at the table. He named individual members, their road names, the things he remembered about them, with the ease of someone who had paid attention for 31 years and had never forgotten anything he considered worth keeping. And then near the end he wrote, "I owe my chapter the truth about one thing I was never brave enough to say out loud. Marisol knows what it is. I asked her to hold it for the right time. I think she'll know when that is. I always trusted her judgment more than my own, which is not something I ever told her, but it was always true. Whatever she decides, that's the right call. She always knew what I couldn't say." Marisol stopped reading. The room was completely quiet. She folded the page carefully, running her thumb along the crease in the particular way of someone giving themselves time to decide something. She put the page back in the main envelope. She put the main envelope inside the smaller one that had already been emptied of its contents. The letter for Declan, which he was now holding in both hands, without having opened it. She looked at Garrett Cole. Garrett Cole looked back at her with the expression of a man who was watching something approach that he has spent a long time hoping would not arrive. Marisol said to the room, "There are some things I need to take care of before we continue." "Give me tonight." She said it like a person who has made a decision and is offering a timeline, not asking for permission. "I'll come back to this tomorrow." Nobody in the room argued with her. Declan stood at the head of the table with his father's letter in his hands and watched Garrett Cole watch Marisol. And he thought about a long list of things he didn't have enough information to resolve yet. Then he looked down at the envelope in his hands, his name in his father's difficult handwriting, the paper worn slightly at the edges, from however long it had lived inside that brown envelope. And he put it in his jacket pocket without opening it. Not yet. Outside in the parking lot, while the chapter house light still burned behind him, he called his Phoenix lawyer and left a message. The property claim was off the table. Come up with another angle, or we go home. He ended the call and stood in the desert night, which had cooled sharply the way Arizona nights do, as if the day had been operating on borrowed warmth and finally returned it, and looked at the line of motorcycles and the industrial street and the rail yard dark beyond it. He thought about the last thing his mother had said to him before he'd flown to Tucson. "Whatever you find there, Declan, Don't let it make you feel anything you don't want to feel. You owe that man nothing. He thought about 31 years of a man knowing his son's birthday and knowing what grade he was in and not being there. He thought about the way Marisol had said she was the one who was there, and then immediately moved to another subject. He put his phone in his pocket and went back inside, because the letter in his jacket felt heavier than paper, and he wasn't ready to be alone with it yet. The price of keeping quiet. The funeral home where Hector Vega's body had been held before the service that morning was now closed, its front windows dark, the parking lot empty, except for a single car at the far end. The building itself was one of those American Southwest structures that tried to soften the business of death with stucco walls and desert landscaping agave and ornamental gravel instead of lawn, and mostly succeeded in making death look like something that could be managed with careful aesthetic choices. Marisol had a key. She'd had a key to this particular building for 11 years, since the previous chaplain had handed it to her, along with the title, and told her that a chaplain needed access to the dead as much as to the living, because the dead still had things to say, and someone needed to be there to receive them. She sat in the small family waiting room, 3 chairs, a box of tissues, a framed print of the Sonoran Desert at sunset, with the brown envelope on the low table in front of her, and her hands folded in her lap, and the specific fatigue of a person who has been performing steadiness for other people all day, and is now, in private, allowed to feel the weight of it. She had not told anyone what else was in the envelope. She had not told anyone because Hector had not given her permission to tell anyone yet, and she had for 20 years organized her behavior around the question of what Hector needed from her. That had been easy for most of those 20 years. It was, it turned out, harder to do for a dead man who had decided to let her carry the decision alone. The brown envelope contained 3 things: the letter for the chapter which she had read, the letter for Declan which she had not read and would not read, and a second sealed document that was neither a letter nor a will, that had the notarization stamp of a Tucson lawyer named Esperanza Mora, and 2 witness signatures, and that Marisol had known the contents of since the night Hector had come to her 2 years ago with shaking hands, and told her what he'd decided to do. She had advised him against it. She had told him that the information in that document would break something that couldn't be fixed, and that the people most hurt by it were people who had nothing to do with what happened. He had listened to everything she said with the patience he'd always had for her opinions, and then he had gone ahead and done it anyway, because Hector Vega had, in the end, been unable to die with it unreleased. And she had taken the envelope and told him she would keep it, and she would handle it when the time came. And she had hoped for 2 years that the time would not come. The time had come. The door opened without a knock. Garrett Cole filled the doorway, broad-shouldered and backlit by the security light in the corridor. And then he stepped through and pulled the door partially closed behind him, and he looked at Marisol with the expression she had been expecting to see from him at some point today and had chosen to defer. "We need to talk," he said. "I know," Marisol said. "Sit down, Garrett." He sat in the chair across from her, the same chair that had held 1,000 grieving family members who had come to wait while someone took care of the practical details of their loss, and he looked at the brown envelope on the table between them, and then back at her. "You didn't open it tonight," he said. "The second document. You told the chapter tomorrow." "Yes." "Because you were buying time." "Because I needed to think," Marisol said. "There's a difference." Garrett leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his large hands loose between them. When he spoke, his voice was careful and lower than his normal register. the voice of a man who is monitoring his own volume deliberately. Marisol. Whatever Hector put in that document, whatever story he decided to tell at the end, he stopped, started again. 20 years have gone by. The chapter has been through a lot in 20 years. What's in that paper is going to blow apart things that people have built on top of what happened. Things that people need. The truth, Marisol said, is not usually scheduled for a convenient time. That's not. Garrett pressed his hands together. I'm not asking you to lie. I'm asking you to think about whether what's in that document serves anyone who's still living. Marisol looked at him for a long time. Garrett Cole was 57 years old. She had known him for 23 of those years. She had married him to his first wife in this chapter. She had presided over his mother's funeral. She knew the sound of his laugh and the way he held himself when he was in pain, and the name of the daughter from his second marriage, who he never talked about, but who he called every Sunday without fail at 8 in the morning, because Sunday at 8 was the custody arrangement, and he honored it without exception. She knew all of those things, and she had known for 20 years something else, and the weight of holding both, and she was only now allowing herself to understand, been enormous. Hector is the one who decided it serves someone, she said. He's the one who made the document. Garrett's jaw tightened. Hector is dead. Yes, Marisol said. He is, and you're not. And that's the thing you want me to consider. She kept her voice level. I've considered it, Garrett. I've been considering it for 20 years. Then consider it once more. His voice had an edge in it now that she recognized, not anger exactly, but the thing underneath anger that anger is usually hiding. Fear. Garrett Cole, captain of Desert Iron Chapter, was afraid. His kid is here, Hector's son. He's already sniffing around the estate, already in the chapter house tonight, watching everything. If you read that document in front of him. Hector knew Declan would be here, Marisol said. Garrett stopped. She watched the implications of that settle over him, the slow comprehension. He planned this, Garrett said, not a question. He planned the envelope, yes. He knew there would be an estate claim when he died. He knew Declan would show up. She folded her hands in her lap. He wanted his son in the room, Garrett. He left him a letter. He wanted Declan to know the full story. Garrett sat back. He was quiet for a long moment, and in the quiet, the funeral home made its small sounds, the HVAC system, the faint creak of a building that was old enough to have opinions about temperature. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The careful, measured tone was gone, replaced by something rawer and, in Marisol's experience, more honest. Do you know what happens to me if that document gets read in front of the chapter? Yes, she said. I know. And you're going to do it anyway. Marisol looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about a night 20 years ago when Garrett had come to her with blood on his jacket and a story that had too many holes in it. And she had made a choice, not because she didn't know the truth, but because the chapter was fractured, and Hector's version of events was gone with him into whatever happened next. And she had believed with the conviction of someone who had not yet fully learned the price of silence, that the living needed to be protected from a truth that would only add damage to damage. She had been wrong about that. It had taken her 20 years to be certain of it, but she was certain now. Hector asked me to keep this until the right time, she said. He said I'd know. She looked up at Garrett. This is the right time. Garrett stood. He was not a person who made small gestures. When his body moved with the specific tension of controlled distress, it moved visibly, fully, the way large structures respond to stress. He walked to the window that looked out onto the dark parking lot and stood with his back to her and his hands on the window frame. "He never forgave me," Garrett said to the window. Not a question this time either. "No," Marisol said. "He didn't." She paused. "But he understood you. He said so in the letter for the chapter. He named you. He said, complicated history." Complicated. Garrett's voice was dry as the desert outside. His word. Marisol stood as well, and she picked up the brown envelope from the table and held it at her side. "Go home, Garrett. Get some sleep. Come to the chapter house tomorrow afternoon and bring whatever you've been carrying for 20 years, because it gets put down tomorrow. That's how this ends." He turned from the window. He looked at her with something she recognized after a moment as a specific kind of grief, not for Hector, who had already died, but for the version of events that was about to stop being possible to maintain. "Will it be enough," he said, "to just read the paper? Or does it go further than that?" Marisol thought about Declan Cole sitting in the chapter house tonight with his father's letter in his jacket pocket and his face arranged around a grief he was refusing to call by its name. She thought about what Hector had written for the chapter. "I owe my chapter the truth about one thing I was never brave enough to say out loud." "The paper goes to the county sheriff," she said, "after the chapter reads it. That was Hector's instruction. Esperanza Mora, the lawyer. She has a copy already." Garrett was very still. "He covered it," Marisol said, not unkindly. "Every angle. He had 2 years and a good lawyer and a lot of sleepless nights to make sure it stuck." She walked to the door and paused with her hand on the frame. "I'm sorry, Garrett. I've been sorry about this for 20 years. But sorry has a limit, and we've been past it for a while." She left him in the waiting room and walked out through the dark corridor and into the parking lot, and she sat in her car and put the envelope on the passenger seat and rested her forehead against the steering wheel and allowed herself, in the privacy of her own vehicle, 3 full minutes of the kind of exhaustion she hadn't let anyone else see. Then she sat up, started the car, and drove east toward the Rincon foothills, where she lived in a house that had been her mother's and would eventually be, she supposed, someone else's. And she thought about Hector Vega and the night 20 years ago, and the choice she had made, and the choice she was going to make tomorrow. And she thought about whether those 2 choices, taken together, would balance out to something she could live with. She thought they might. She wasn't certain, but she thought they might. Declan was at the cemetery before sunrise. He hadn't slept. He'd opened his father's letter at 2 in the morning, lying on the hotel bed with the lamp on, and had read it twice, slowly, and then had lain in the dark for 2 hours with the letter on the bedside table and the ceiling above him, and the sounds of the Arizona night through the poorly sealed window frame. The letter was not long. It was written in the same labored handwriting as the address on the envelope, with the same quality of effort, someone who wanted the words to be legible because they mattered, not because writing came easily. It began, "I know I have no right to explain, but I want to try." It continued for 3 paragraphs that Declan was not going to share with anyone, and it ended with, "I didn't leave because I didn't want you. That's the one thing I need you to know. Whatever else you've been told or whatever else you've believed, I need you to know that one thing was never true." Declan had read that last sentence 6 times, and it had not resolved itself into anything manageable. So he had gotten up before 4, dressed in the dark, driven to the cemetery, and was now standing in front of a headstone that was still raw from the recent installation. The stone wasn't in place yet, just a temporary marker in the pre-dawn silence. The rincons were a dark shape to the east, and the sky above them was beginning to separate from black into the deep blue that precedes light. And the desert around the cemetery had the particular stillness of early morning that makes everything in it feel like it's been there since the beginning of the world. Declan put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the temporary marker with his father's name on it, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say yet that he knew how to say. He heard footsteps behind him, not careful enough to be sneaking, deliberate enough to be intentional, and he turned. The man who approached was old by chapter standards, which meant mid-70s, with the weathered look of someone who had spent decades outdoors, and the careful walk of someone whose knees had logged too many miles. He wore a chapter vest over a flannel shirt, and he had a thermos in one hand. "Figured someone might come out here early," the man said. He held out the thermos. "Coffee." Declan took it because it was cold and he hadn't slept. "Your chapter retired," the man said. He didn't offer his name immediately, the way people don't when they're deciding how much of themselves to give to an unknown quantity. "I was riding with the Desert Iron before you were born. Knew your father since the beginning." Declan held the thermos with both hands. "Since the beginning of what?" "Since he came to us." The man stood beside him and looked at the marker, his hands in his pockets. "He came to Tucson about 6 months after things changed for him up north. He had a reputation for mechanical work, and he was good on a road, and he kept his word, which was enough to get a prospect patch." He paused. "Your father earned everything in this chapter twice over. He wasn't given anything." Declan absorbed this without comment. The man continued in the way of someone who has been waiting for the right listener for a long time. "People have a picture of what this life looks like from the outside. Not always wrong, but not always the whole picture either. Hector, your father, he wasn't here because he was running from something. He was here because this was the place that made sense to him after things fell apart." "Things fell apart," Declan said. His voice came out flatter than he intended. "Things fell apart is a careful way to say a man abandoned his family." The old man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is that what your mother told you? That he left?" Declan looked at him. "I'm not saying she lied," the man said. "I'm saying there was more to what happened than left covers. There was pressure on your father to go, from inside the chapter he'd been with before he came here. Some people wanted him gone, for reasons that had nothing to do with his family, and everything to do with something that went wrong on a night outside of Flagstaff. And the easiest way to make him gone was to make his life somewhere else impossible." He looked at the marker. "I'm not saying this to make you feel a certain way about him. I'm saying it because you're here and you deserve to have the whole story." The sky was getting lighter. To the east, the rincons were emerging from the dark, their corrugated ridgelines filling in with detail as the light came up. Declan said carefully, "What happened outside of Flagstaff?" The old man shook his head. "That's not mine to tell. That's in Marisol's keeping." He looked at Declan sideways. "She'll tell you tomorrow, if you let her." Declan thought about his father's letter on the bedside table of his hotel room. "I didn't leave because I didn't want you." He thought about his mother's voice on the phone. "Don't let it make you feel anything you don't want to feel." He thought about Marisol's hands on the pulpit, and the envelope in her pocket, and the way she'd looked at him in the aisle of the church, not with contempt, and not with pity, but with something that had the particular weight of foreknowledge.
"She's been sitting on whatever it is for 20 years, he said.
"Yes," the old man said, "she has, and she's paid for it." He took the thermos back when Declan offered it, poured 2 cups from the cap, handed one back. The price of keeping quiet is that the quiet costs you more over time, not less. I think she knows that. I think she's been knowing it. They stood in the cemetery in the early morning and drank bad thermos coffee and did not speak, because some moments between people who have just said something true require the decency of silence afterward. When the sun cleared the Rincon ridgeline and threw its first hard horizontal light across the graves, Declan handed back the thermos cap and said, "Thank you." The old man shrugged in the way of someone who has not done anything he considers remarkable. Then he said, "Your father rode out here once a year on his birthday, always early, before anyone was around, just to be somewhere quiet." He looked across the graves with the particular expression of a person who has outlived enough people that cemeteries have become familiar geography. He said it was the one place where you didn't have to pretend you knew what anything meant. Declan looked at the marker with his father's name. He thought about going to find Marisol. He didn't go. Not yet. Instead, he stayed, because his father had apparently found value in this particular quiet, and he thought that understanding that was maybe the first true thing he'd figured out since he'd gotten off the plane in Tucson. He stayed until the sun was fully up, and the desert was fully lit, and the cemetery had lost its pre-dawn quality and become what it was in daylight, a place where people had been put, not a place where anything was hidden. Then he went to find Marisol. He found her at the chapter house, in the small office off the main room, sitting with a cup of coffee and a legal pad she'd been writing on. She looked up when he knocked on the open door and read something in his face that told her where he'd been. "You went to the cemetery," she said. "I talked to an old man who didn't give me his name," Declan said. "He told me there was pressure on my father to leave, that it wasn't entirely his choice." Marisol put the legal pad down. She looked at him without the careful management of expression she'd employed through yesterday, and what he saw underneath was not regret exactly, more like the face of a person standing at the edge of something they've been approaching for a very long time. "Sit down," she said, "and ask me what you want to ask." Declan sat. He looked at her across the small office with its shelves of chapter records and the photograph on the wall, aerial view of the desert, taken from altitude. The scale of it, enormous and indifferent, and somehow comforting. He said, "What happened outside of Flagstaff?" Marisol was quiet for a breath. Then she said, "Let me tell you what I'm going to do tomorrow, and then I'm going to tell you that you were right to ask, and that I'm sorry it took this long for you to be in a room where someone could answer." She held his eyes, and in hers he saw the specific quality of someone making a decision that has been made slowly over decades and is only arriving now at its final form. "Whatever my father left in that document," Declan said, "you've known about it." "Yes," she said, "I've known." "For how long?" 20 years, she said, give or take. The room held that between them, and Declan felt, in the peculiar clarity of having slept not at all, and stood in a cemetery before sunrise and drunk bad coffee with a stranger, the specific texture of something very large becoming only slightly less opaque. "All right," he said. He didn't say he forgave her for it because he wasn't certain yet whether he did, but he said all right, because he was beginning to understand that Marisol Reyes was not the enemy of this story, and that Garrett Cole had been watching her, not with the hostility of someone watching a threat, but with the fear of someone watching something inevitable approach. Marisol reached into the pocket of her vest and touched the brown envelope without removing it. An unconscious gesture, the kind that belongs to a person confirming that something they have been responsible for is still there. "Tomorrow," she said. "In front of the chapter." She paused. "And in front of you." Declan nodded. He stood to go, and at the door he stopped without turning around, because there was one more thing he needed to say, and he wasn't going to look at her when he said it. "He wrote that he didn't leave because he didn't want me," he said. The room was quiet behind him. "No," Marisol said. Her voice was very even. "He didn't leave because he didn't want you. That was never true." Declan walked out into the morning, every word he never got to say. The chapter house at 3 in the afternoon had a different quality than it had had the night before. The food was gone. The folding tables had been pushed back against the walls, and the chairs were arranged in a loose, inward-facing configuration that was less formal than a meeting and more deliberate than a casual gathering. The light came through the high industrial windows at a low-angle October afternoon light that was golden and hard-edged, and threw long shadows across the concrete floor. 34 members had come back, not all 60 from the service. Some had ridden home last night. Some had chapter responsibilities elsewhere. Some had the particular instinct of people who sense that what is about to happen in a room is not something they need to be present for. The 34 who came were the ones who either needed to know or felt responsible for being there when it happened. Garrett Cole was in the 3rd row, not the front. He had positioned himself off-center near the aisle, the way a person positions themselves when they are calculating angles of exit. Declan sat in the back, as he had been asked. He was in the same clothes as yesterday. He had not gone back to the hotel, had not changed, had spent most of the night and morning in a state of alertness that had bypassed sleep entirely, and he looked it, and he didn't particularly care. The letter from his father was in his inside jacket pocket, pressed against his ribs on the left side. Marisol stood at the front, and she had the brown envelope in one hand, open now, and the 3 documents fanned out in her other hand. And she looked like— Declan searched for the word and found it, and it surprised him. A person who has finally stopped bracing. She said, "Thank you for coming back. I know some of you drove a long way." She looked around the room. "I'll be brief in what I say before I read, because what matters here is Hector's words, not mine. But I owe you some context, because what I'm about to share involves a decision I made 20 years ago that I made wrong, and I want you to understand that I know that." The room was very still. 20 years ago, Garrett Cole was involved in an incident that resulted in serious harm to a person connected to this chapter. I was told about it. I made the decision not to report it and not to bring it to the chapter leadership because I believed at the time that the damage of disclosure was greater than the damage of silence. She paused. I was wrong about that. Silence doesn't reduce damage. It relocates it. It moves it into the bodies and the lives of people who didn't choose to carry it, and it makes them carry it anyway. And the fact that I didn't intend that outcome doesn't change the outcome. She looked directly at Garrett. I'm saying this before the document is read, because I want it to be clear that the accountability here is not only Garrett's, it's mine as well. The room absorbed this without sound. From the 3rd row, Garrett said evenly, "Marisol." She looked at him. "You didn't cause what happened," he said. "I did." "Yes," she said. "You did, and I let you keep it." She turned back to the room. "Now Hector's going to say it instead." She separated the notarized document from the others and placed the remaining papers back in the envelope. And she held the document in both hands, and she read. The document was, as she had told Declan, a signed and notarized written account with witness signatures, a neighbor who had been present that night, and a mechanic who had worked 2 bays down from where it had happened. It was dated 22 months ago. The language was plain, because Hector had always preferred plain language, and the notary had apparently honored that preference. It stated that on a night in early November 20 years prior, on a rural road outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, Garrett Cole, then a member of the Flagstaff chapter of the Hells Angels, had been operating a vehicle under the influence of alcohol, and had struck another vehicle head-on. The driver of the other vehicle had been injured severely enough to require hospitalization and had sustained permanent partial disability. That driver had been Hector Vega. The accident had been reported by Garrett and 2 other chapter members who arrived on scene before the authorities as a multi-vehicle incident initiated by the other driver. The breathalyzer discrepancy had been managed by a chapter contact in the county sheriff's department. Hector's injuries had prevented him from contesting the official account in the immediate aftermath, and by the time he had recovered enough to do so, he had been pressured through a sustained campaign of intimidation and isolation conducted by members of the Flagstaff chapter on Garrett's behalf to accept a settlement and leave. The settlement had included a non-disclosure clause. The pressure had included visits to his home address, where his wife and 8-year-old son were living. Hector Vega had left his family not because he chose to, but because leaving was the price paid for their safety, and he had honored that price for 31 years, because it was the only choice available to a man who had been outmaneuvered by people with more organizational power than he had, and who had learned too late that the documentation of that power could not be challenged from the outside. The document was Hector's challenge from the inside. 2 years ago, when his health had begun to fail, he had gone to Esperanza Mora and given her everything he remembered and everything he had kept receipts notes, the names of witnesses who were still living and had made a sworn statement. He had asked that the statement be held until after his death, because he did not want Garrett Cole to have time to respond before the chapter heard it. He had spent 20 years riding with Desert Iron because Desert Iron had taken him in when the Flagstaff chapter had made his previous life impossible, and because the men of Desert Iron had over 3 decades become his family in the specific way that chosen family becomes family when the original one has been taken from you. He had not told them what happened because he had believed for 20 years that to tell them would be to bring the trouble down on them that had been brought down on him. By the time he had understood that the trouble was going to arrive anyway in the form of his own death, it was too late to do it any other way than this. The last line of the document read, "I want my son to know I thought about him every day. I want the chapter to know I am proud of every mile we rode. And I want Garrett Cole to know that I forgave him before I finished writing this, because I was tired of carrying the unforgiveness. But that forgiveness and accountability are not the same thing, and this document is the accountability part." Marisol lowered the paper. The room did not break into noise the way rooms sometimes do when something large lands in them. It was quiet in the specific way of people who are processing something that is larger than the container of any single reaction. Then from the 3rd row, Garrett Cole stood up. He didn't say anything immediately. He stood, and he looked at the floor between his feet, and the room watched him. And then he looked up at Marisol and said in a voice that had lost all of its earlier measured quality and was now simply the voice of a man who has had 20 years of something removed from him in the space of 10 minutes. I know, he said again, and this time it was not for Marisol, but for the room. I know what I did. I know what it cost. His eyes moved to Declan in the back row, and he held there. I know what it cost him. Declan sat completely still. Garrett said, I have been waiting for this room for 20 years. I told myself I was afraid of it, but I think what I was actually afraid of was that it wouldn't come, and I'd carry it the rest of the way by myself, and that seemed... He stopped. That seemed worse. He sat back down. Marisol said to the room, Esperanza Mora is filing a copy of this document with the Coconino County Sheriff's Department tomorrow morning. This is Hector's legal record of what happened. It doesn't undo the statute of limitations on the accident itself. That's a legal question for the lawyers to sort. But it establishes a documented record of the pressure campaign against Hector and his family, which has different standing. She folded the document. I'm not going to tell anyone what to do with that information. That's for the chapter to determine. She looked at the room for a moment, all of it, all 34 faces. And then she said, Hector died 2 weeks ago Tuesday. He died in the house he'd lived in for 15 years, with 3 chapter members present, and one of them holding his hand. He was not alone. He told me a week before he died that he had been happy. She paused. I believe him. I think he found a version of the life he was owed, even if it wasn't the one that was taken from him. And I think he would want us to sit with that for a minute before we decide what comes next. The room sat with it. Declan was sitting in the back with his hands flat on his thighs and the letter from his father pressing against his ribs from the inside of his jacket, and the particular physical sensation of someone who has been operating on a wrong premise for 20 years and has just had the premise removed. He thought about his mother and what she had known and what she had done with what she knew. He thought about that for exactly as long as it took to understand that this was not the room or the moment for that particular set of questions. And then he set it aside, because there was something more immediate he needed to understand first. He had come to Tucson to collect an inheritance. He had found instead the reason his father had never come home, written out in a dead man's careful handwriting and notarized by a stranger, and read aloud in a converted warehouse in the Arizona afternoon by a woman who had been carrying it like a stone for 2 decades. He didn't know what to do with that yet, but he knew, and this was the first thing he'd known with certainty since he'd gotten off the plane, that the story he'd been living inside of for 30 years was not the true story. From the 3rd row, Garrett Cole was looking at nothing. His hands were flat on his knees, and his breathing was visible from across the room, slow, deliberate, the breathing of someone managing something physical. Marisol caught Declan's eyes from across the room. She held them for a moment. Her expression did not carry apology, and did not carry relief. It carried something that Declan slowly identified as the specific face of a person who has set down something enormously heavy and has not yet learned to stand without it. He stood up. The room noticed, but did not react. And he walked, not to Marisol, not to Garrett, not to the front of the room at all, but to the door. Because he needed to be outside. Because the room was too small for what was happening inside him. And the desert had been accommodating to this kind of thing, since long before any of them arrived in it. He pushed through the door into the October afternoon, and the light hit him with the particular force of Arizona sun in the late afternoon, gold and absolute, and he walked to the far end of the parking lot and stood with his back to the chapter house and his face to the empty industrial street. And he said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Not yet. Behind him, through the walls of the chapter house, he could hear the muffled sounds of the room beginning to move. Chairs, voices, the specific acoustic texture of a large group of people deciding what to do with something true that has just been placed among them. He had not opened the letter in his pocket after 2 in the morning. He had it memorized. I didn't leave because I didn't want you. In the empty industrial street, with the rail yard dark to the south, and the rincones lit up to the east, and the sound of the chapter house behind him, Declan Cole put his head down and allowed himself, for the first time in a very long time, to feel exactly what he was feeling. It wasn't clean. It wasn't resolved. Garrett Cole was still in that room, and the legal questions were still open. And there were things his mother had known that he didn't have the full shape of yet. And Marisol Reyes had carried a truth for 20 years that she should have put down a long time ago. But none of that was the loudest thing right now. The loudest thing right now was the sentence, "I know what it cost him." And the sentence underneath that, "He didn't leave because he didn't want you." And under that, quieter and more specific, a man who knew his son's birthday and knew what grade he was in and brought tamales to people's families at 2 in the morning and argued with himself out loud until things made enough sense to settle. That was the loudest thing. What you bury and what you don't. The chapter dispersed slowly in the particular way of people who have witnessed something significant and are not quite ready to carry it back into their separate lives yet. They moved in pairs and small groups, talking in low voices in the parking lot, hands wrapped around coffee cups someone had produced from the chapter house kitchen. The motorcycles left in 1s and 2s, the engines a diminishing thread of sound that the desert absorbed and held, and eventually released into silence. Garrett Cole did not leave. He sat in his chair in the chapter house after the others had gone, with his hands on his knees and his back straight, in the expression of a man who has calculated his angles of exit and found that none of them are actually available. The chapter president, a man named Briggs, compact and deliberate, who had listened to the entire reading without visible reaction, and who had spoken privately with Marisol for 12 minutes immediately after, came back inside at 4:30 and stood in front of Garrett without sitting. Briggs said, "You knew Esperanza Mora already had a copy." "Yes," Garrett said. "So you understood that walking out of here wasn't going to change anything?" "Yes," Garrett said again. Briggs looked at him for a long moment, with the expression of a man who has been doing this particular kind of reckoning for long enough to have learned that the judgment doesn't get easier with repetition. It just gets more precise. "You need to speak with chapter legal before tomorrow morning. Whatever the lawyers find in the statute of limitations situation, there's going to be process. You understand that?" "I understand." "And the pressure campaign?" Briggs said. "The visits to his family. That's going to be the harder part legally. And I want you to understand that the chapter's position—" "I'm not going to put the chapter in the middle of this," Garrett said. He raised his eyes to meet Briggs. "Whatever comes, comes to me, not to anyone else. That was my doing. I'm not asking anyone to stand in front of it." Briggs studied him. Then he said, "You're going to call the lawyer tonight, before 10. "Yes." Briggs nodded. He moved toward the door, then stopped. 20 years, Garrett." His voice was not angry. It was something more like the tone of a man looking at a long distance and understanding finally the actual size of it. 20 years, and you rode with us." "I rode with you," Garrett said, "because I had nowhere else to be after Flagstaff, and because I thought I told myself I could do something useful here." He looked at the wall where the chapter banner hung, "Desert Iron, Tucson, A.Z. Est, 1987. "I think I did some useful things. I also know that doesn't balance the books." "No," Briggs said, "it doesn't." He left. The door, swung closed.
The chapter house was empty except for Garrett and the sound of his breathing and the light coming through the high windows at the angle that told him it was getting toward evening. He sat there for a while. Then he got out his phone and called the chapter lawyer. Marisol found Declan in the parking lot. He was leaning against the side of his rental car with his arms crossed, facing east, watching the rincons change color as the sun moved down behind the western mountains. The way the desert light worked in this hour, the shadows moved visibly on the ridge lines. You could almost see them slide. She stopped beside him and did not speak immediately, because she had learned over many years of ministerial work that people who are standing in parking lots looking at mountains generally have something to say and are figuring out how to start. After about 2 minutes, Declan said, "I need you to explain to me why." Marisol said, "Which part?" He turned to look at her. His face had the particular quality of someone who has had a large emotional structure removed from them and is standing in the space where it used to be. Not empty exactly, but exposed. 20 years, he said. You knew for 20 years? And you kept it? Marisol met his eyes. She'd been ready for this, had been preparing for it since the moment she'd made her decision in the funeral home last night. And being ready for something did not mean it didn't land with weight. Yes, she said. Was it because you were protecting the chapter? Partly, she said. At the beginning, mostly. The chapter was fragile in some specific ways at that point in time, and I think I genuinely believed, that the disclosure would do more damage than the silence. She held his gaze. I was wrong. I understood that within 5 years. It took me another 15 to understand it enough to know what to do. 15 years, Declan said, and his voice was controlled, but the control was thin, the way ice goes thin at the edges first. For 15 years you knew and you understood you were wrong, and my father was living 30 minutes away from the family he'd been forced out of. Yes, she said. She did not look away from him. Yes, that is what happened. He unfolded his arms and pressed the heels of his hands against the roof of the rental car and looked at the ground between his feet. Do you know what he did? His voice was very low. On my birthdays, what he did. She was quiet. He sent a card, Declan said. Every year until I was about 16. My mother threw them out. I found 3 of them in a shoebox in her closet when I was 22. He looked up at the mountains. I didn't know who they were from. They weren't signed, just a card with the year on it, and sometimes a newspaper clipping from Tucson. An article about something, just something that was happening. He stopped. I didn't know they were from him. I just thought my mother had kept some old mail that didn't mean anything. Marisol closed her eyes for a moment. I found out they were from him, from the lawyer, Declan said. 6 months ago, when the estate came up. The lawyer found a card supplier in Tucson who had 30 years of a cash order going to an address in Flagstaff that then forwarded to Phoenix. He was still sending them after I moved. He was quiet for a beat. I hadn't opened any of the last 12. I didn't know who they were from, and I had a routine, and I filed them in a box. Marisol said nothing. There was nothing that was adequate here. So, yes, Declan said. I need you to explain to me why. Not because I'm going to do anything about it, but because I need to understand how a person, a good person, I think you are a good person, I think that's clear, makes a decision like that and lives with it for 20 years. Marisol turned to look at the mountains with him side by side, now not facing each other. Because some conversations are easier when you're both looking at the same thing. She said, I made a mistake in the belief that I was preventing a larger harm,
That belief was wrong. The harm happened anyway. It just happened in a distributed way, spread across your life and his life, and the chapter's capacity to know itself truthfully, instead of in a concentrated and visible way that could have been addressed. She paused. I have told myself many things about why I held it. Loyalty, institutional stability, the complexity of the law. Some of those reasons were real. None of them were sufficient. Declan said nothing. She continued, "The truest reason, if I'm going to be honest with you, is that I loved this chapter. I love it, the way you love something you've given yourself to for a long time, and Garrett was part of it, and what he'd done was terrible. But he was also someone who had shown up for this community in real ways in the years since. And I couldn't reconcile those two things. The man who did something terrible, and the man who became someone useful." She felt the weight of the confession, the specific texture of saying aloud what you have said only to yourself for a long time. "So, I chose not to." "To reconcile them," Declan said. "To act on the contradiction," she said. "Yes, I sat with the contradiction, and I called it wisdom, and it was cowardice." The word landed cleanly, without drama, the way she'd said it in the chapter house. The accounting of a person who has stopped managing the distance between what happened and what should have happened. Declan was quiet for a long time. The light on the rincons was deep orange now, the ridges lit and the canyons in shadow, the boundary between them sharp and precise. He said, "Did he know you were carrying it?" "Yes," Marisol said. "He knew. He never asked me to do anything about it. That was his decision, not mine. He'd made his peace with it in a way I hadn't been able to." She paused. "He said once, maybe 10 years ago, that he thought I was harder on myself about it than he was. That he had the choice back in Flagstaff, and he made it for his family, and he was at peace with it, and that I was carrying the guilt for everyone involved, and that was a weight nobody had asked me to pick up." She looked at her hands. "He told me to put it down. I didn't know how." Declan turned away from the mountains and looked at her directly. She didn't look away. He said, "You read his document today?" "Yes," she said. That was putting it down. She thought about that. "Yes," she said. "I think it was." A long silence. The parking lot was empty, except for them and the rental car, and the distant sound of a train in the rail yard to the south. Then Declan said, "I'm not saying I'm done being angry about it." "That's fair," Marisol said. "I'm saying—" He stopped, looked at the ground, then looked back at her. "I came here for a property claim. I came here with lawyers and paperwork, and 3 men and a plan, and none of that." He made a small gesture with one hand that was, she thought, the gesture of a person who has run out of the specific language they started with, and hasn't yet found the language for where they've arrived. "None of that is what this is." "No," Marisol said, "it's not." He put his hands back in his pockets. "What do I do with it?" he said, and his voice was not the voice he'd used in the church, not controlled and projecting authority, but the voice underneath that, the one that sounded more like a man who had not slept in 2 days and had just had 20 years of a false story replaced with a true one, and didn't know yet what the true one required of him. Marisol said, "Tonight, nothing. Tonight you eat something, and you sleep, and you let the information be what it is without trying to manage it." She paused. "Tomorrow, if you want, you come back to the cemetery, and I'll finish the burial service properly. There was a part I didn't get to yesterday." Declan looked at her. "What part?" "The part I was going to read before you walked in," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite a rebuke,
and not quite forgiveness, but something between them, the specific register of two people who have given each other good reasons for difficulty and are cautiously beginning to understand that difficulty is not the whole of what they are to each other. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, 8 in the morning. 8 in the morning, Marisol said. He opened the car door. Then he stopped with one hand on the door and looked back at her, and the evening light was doing something specific to his face, softening the controlled lines of it. Or maybe that was just what happened when a person stopped bracing against something for a few hours. He said, "My father, did he know I was coming here, specifically?" Marisol said, "He knew you'd come eventually. He said you had his stubbornness." Something moved across her face that she didn't entirely suppress. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. The particular expression of someone whose grief and affection for the same person are momentarily occupying the same space. He said it like a compliment. Declan got in the car without answering that, but she noticed, as he pulled the door closed, that his face had done something it hadn't done since he'd walked through the door of the church yesterday morning. It had stopped performing. She watched the rental car pull out of the lot and head north toward the hotel district, and she stood in the empty parking lot as the last of the direct sunlight left the Rincon ridges, and the whole eastern sky went into the long Sonoran dusk. At 8 in the morning, the cemetery was quiet, and the air was cold and clear with the specific clarity of the desert after a night below 50 degrees, and the marigolds on Hector Vega's grave were slightly wilted, but still yellow. Declan arrived at 7:58, which Marisol thought was probably as close to punctuality as his particular kind of pride would allow, when the appointment had been her suggestion and not his. He had slept. She could see it in his face. The restoration of some basic human processing that had been missing yesterday. He had also apparently gone back to the hotel and changed clothes, which she took as a sign that something in him had settled enough to attend to practical things. He brought coffee, 2 cups from a place on South 6th, which made Marisol stop when she saw the logo on the cups. "That's where he got the tamales," she said. Declan looked at the cup. "I know," he said quietly. "I looked it up." She took the cup. They walked to the grave, and they stood before the temporary marker in the early morning light. And Marisol held her coffee in one hand and reached into her vest with the other and took out not the brown envelope, but a small index card, handwritten, the kind of thing that is a note to oneself rather than a formal document. Declan said, "What is that?" "My notes for the part of the service I didn't finish," she said. "I wrote it yesterday. I had the original version for 20 years, but the original version was for a funeral without you in the room." She turned the card in her fingers. "This one has you in it." He looked at the card. He looked at the grave. Then he looked at her and said, "Go ahead." Marisol tucked the index card back into her pocket and did not read from it. She spoke from memory, because the thing she had been carrying for 20 years was not something she needed notes for. She spoke about Hector Vega in the specific way of someone who has known a person through many seasons, not as a character in a story, not as a symbol of anything, but as a person who had been specific and difficult and consistent and funny and present, who had brought tamales and argued with himself and ridden 31 years of Arizona road and loved his chapter and missed his son every day of those 31 years with the particular ache of someone who has done the thing they believed was right and has never entirely stopped paying for it. She spoke about what she thought it meant, not theologically, not in the formal register of the ministry, but in the plain language that Hector had always preferred. To carry someone you've lost, and to carry someone you've had to put down, and to understand, eventually,
that both of those things are love. Just love in different shapes. She said, Hector Vega lived a life that was not the life he was supposed to have. He was robbed of it at 31 by a set of circumstances that were not his fault, and that he could not fully fight at the time. And he built a different life here, in this desert, with this chapter. And that life was real, and was his, and was full. That's not a consolation prize. That's what people do with what they're given. She looked at Declan. He would want you to know that the life here was real, that the love here was real, and that the love for you was always the same category of thing, not smaller because it was at a distance, not less because it was silent. Declan was looking at the temporary marker. She said, the last thing he said to me a week before he died was that he wanted his son to know him, not to forgive him, not to understand him, just to know him. She paused. So, if you want to know him, Declan, I knew him for 31 years. I have time. A long silence. The cemetery bird that had been present yesterday morning, something small and desert plain, was making its sound from somewhere in the scrub to the north. Then Declan said, without looking away from the grave, he argued with himself out loud. Constantly, Marisol said. Both sides, all the way to a conclusion. It was very annoying and very effective. Something happened in Declan's face. Not a smile, not quite, but the muscular suggestion of one, the place where a smile starts, before a person decides whether to let it finish. My assistant, he said, has told me for 4 years that I do that. Marisol said nothing, but she took a drink of her coffee to give herself something to do with her face. Declan said to the grave, both sides. Then, after a moment, to Marisol, he was never going to be easy, was he? Absolutely not, Marisol said. Neither am I. I'm aware, she said. You came to a funeral with a legal team and a strategy. That's not a man who makes things easy. I made the legal team stand down, he said. After 60 bikers stood up in a church, she said. The timing is relevant. And there it was, the thing that was not quite a smile finished on his face, brief and real, and the specific kind of quiet the face makes when grief and something less heavy arrive in the same moment, and find, unexpectedly, that they can share the space. He looked at her. She looked at him. The morning light was doing what October morning light does in the desert, precise and clean, making everything it touched look recently decided. He said, I don't know what I'm going to do about my mother. That's a separate conversation, Marisol said. One thing at a time. I don't know what I'm going to do about any of this. Also a separate conversation, she said. Right now you're at your father's grave, and you just heard the part of the service that was written for you specifically. And those are the only facts that need to be true for the next few minutes. He turned back to the grave. She stood beside him and drank her coffee, and let the minutes be what they were, the morning, and the birds and the rincons lit up to the east, and the temporary marker with a man's name on it, and the specific quality of two people who have been through something large together, beginning to understand the shape of what they are to each other. After a while, Declan said, he got tamales from the same place every time. Every time, Marisol said. For 31 years, the same order. He said variety was overrated when you found something right. That's, Declan stopped. Exactly what you'd expect from that man. Marisol finished, and this time they were both laughing quietly at the grave of someone they had both lost, and were both, in different ways and different times, only beginning to mourn properly. The laughter was brief, and it was not large, and it did not make anything less painful. But it was real, and it was theirs. and it was the sound of people who are, despite everything, still willing to be alive in the same moment together. When it subsided, they were quiet again. Marisol said, "He would have liked you, you know, on the level of purely two people in a room. He would have liked who you are." Declan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think I would have argued with him constantly."
"He would have loved that," Marisol said. "He argued with himself. Imagine what he would have done with an outside participant." Declan looked at her. Something in his face had shifted entirely from what it had been when he walked through the door of the church 2 days ago. The projected authority, the legal confidence, the set of the jaw that meant, "I have paperwork and I intend to use it." That was all still in there somewhere, she suspected. But it was no longer the front row. What was in the front row now was something quieter and more uncertain, and considerably more his own. He said, "The tamale place opens at 9. Marisol looked at him. "I was thinking," he said, with the care of a man selecting words from a category that does not come naturally to him, "that I could buy you breakfast and you could tell me about him." "About the 31 years. He paused. "If that's something you'd want to do." Marisol looked at the grave of Hector Vega and thought about 31 years of knowing someone and being known by them and carrying their heaviest thing, and now, at the end of it, being asked to hand the good parts, the tamales, and the road miles, and the both sides of the argument, and the man who showed up at 2 in the morning with food, to the one person who should have had them all along. She thought, this is what he meant when he said she'd know. "Yes," she said, "that's something I'd want to do." They left the grave as the October morning fully opened up around them, the light going from gold to clear, and the desert showing its true colors in the way it only does when the angle is right. And they walked out of the cemetery, side by side, not touching, not quite, but close enough that the distance between them had changed from the distance of strangers to something smaller and more deliberate. And the Rincons stood witness to the east, the way they had stood witness to everything that had come before, and would stand witness to everything that came after, patient as the desert always is, which is to say, completely.